right, I hope everyone had a great lunch despite the fire alarm and is ready to dive into a topic that can be a bit heavy, both in complexity and consequence. Today we're tackling the profound disruption that technology is bringing to conflict around the world, from Ukraine to the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, or basically elsewhere. This disruption spans across every domain: land, sea, air, space, cyber, and even the information space. It's fast-moving, far-reaching, and often hard to digest. My name is Stavros Peridis. I'm a fellow at the SAIS Emerging Technologies Initiative here at SAIS and part of the team that helped bring this symposium together. Our goal has been to convene key voices from industry, policy, and academia to engage in meaningful conversations around the intersection of technology and strategy. This panel will explore how cybersecurity, AI, autonomous weapons, and space technologies are reshaping modern warfare and international security. It's a broad and fast-evolving topic, so we encourage you to bring your own questions and perspectives at the Q&A at the end. To guide us through this discussion, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Professor Joshua White, to my right. Professor White is a professor of practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS and director of the U.S. Asian and U.S. Pacific Institutes for Rising Leaders. He previously served as senior advisor and director for South Asian affairs at the National Security Council under President Obama, and has held positions at the Department of Defense and the Stimson Center. A leading scholar on South Asian politics, defense policy, and Islamic movements, he's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. Professor White holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here for the happy topic in this symposium. I'm delighted to be here and to have a real all-star panel. I'd like to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to dive into the themes for today. At the end of the row is Professor Thomas Ridd, who is the founding director of the Alperovich Institute for Cybersecurity Studies here at SAIS. Well known to many of you. Next to him is Joshua Marcuse, who is Director of Strategic Initiatives at Google Public Sector, formerly served as the Executive Director of the Defense Innovation Board, and served in other roles in the Department of Defense as well. Next to him, Dr. Radha Plumb, who is Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Perry Worldhouse and a Senior Fellow at the Wharton Accountable AI Lab at Penn, and former Chief Digital and AI Officer at the Department of Defense, and before that, the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and many other roles in the corporate sector at the NSC and elsewhere. And then to my immediate right, Dr. Jane Pinelis, Chief AI Engineer of the Applied Information Sciences Branch at the Applied Physics Lab, which is affiliated with Johns Hopkins University. And she served as the inaugural Chief of AI Assurance at the Department of Defense's Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, which is a mouthful. There we go. And holds a PhD in statistics, so don't mess with her on any math questions that might arise. I'm really happy today to be able to have a conversation about disruptive technology and conflict. A few of us, in talking about this panel, recognize that we were given a very wide scope of a theme, and each person here brings a different perspective to it. And so instead of starting with grand strategic thought about disruptive technologies, I thought we might start with something a little bit more concrete that has been in the news, that has focused a great deal of attention outside of government and within government on how technologies are changing the nature of warfare, and that is the war in Ukraine. And we might not spend a lot of time talking about that particular conflict, but it has been a touchstone of the public debate about how technologies are or are not changing the way that war happens, the way that conflict plays out in the modern world. And so I wanted to start with Radha in particular, and then maybe move to Thomas for his views, including on the cybersecurity angle, about what is it, first orient us to what it is we're seeing in Ukraine that feels different or novel, and then if you could speak to some broad lessons that the US defense system or others are taking away from that conflict. And I'd like you, both of you could, to speak to good lessons and false lessons, right? Are there things that we're learning that we maybe should not be learning about war because we're looking at a particular conflict? So I'll start with the two of you, and then if the others want to chime in on this topic, I would invite them to as well.
So this is a super easy question, so I'm glad to start. No, I think, let me start by just orienting to the war in Ukraine itself, right? So you have essentially an invasion of a large country with a well-defined, well-formed military to a considerably smaller country with considerably less direct military assets, right? So that's, I think, the nature of the conflict. That's helpful to think of that as sort of like both the asymmetric size, investment, economies, and populations to think about the lessons learned on the back end, which I'll come back to in a second. So in practice, what we saw in Ukraine over the first few years is a real push to get parity in the weaponry and armed forces structure and status in Ukraine to provide effective counters to Russia. What did that mean in practice? It meant a lot of stuff going from Western allied nations and broadly a sort of unified coalition that coordinated aid donations of both economic aid, financial supports for the Ukrainian government, and most critically, direct military assistance and military aid that allowed them to mount defenses and also engage in offensive planning and activity, as well as advising and intelligence sharing. So that piece actually looks really similar to the types of advising and assisting, which the scale was tremendous and the speed at which it was done was enormous. But in practice, it looks similar to a lot of the things we've done. What you observed then was just a real quagmire of a conflict, right? With high-low, right? You saw trench digging and exchange of mortar fires. But you see this evolving, really high-end fight that's happening in parallel. And that's what I want to focus on, the kind of disruptive tech side of it. So you're digging trenches, you're like literally lobbing mortars and grenades, putting in minefields and wires to try to manage maneuvers, and then also innovating in really tight cycles the integration of commercial technology, commercial drone technology in particular, linked to communication networks, linked to essentially things that explode. Right? Those can be expensive bombs, they can be not so expensive bombs, those can be targeted and more precise, those can be extremely imprecise, but you're essentially taking explosives of some nature, putting them on something that can fly and maneuver, and trying to communicate it with it to get to its target. And that has, the evolution of what that particular form of warfare looks like has changed so much in just the 2 years we observed it, that's, I think, driving a lot of the conversations and lessons. So with that context, let me give my view on like the big lesson and the big wrong lesson. We'll start with the wrong lesson. I think the wrong lesson is we've got to put a lot of money into sort of the pre-R&D, the pre-government-owned ecosystem. And I say that because a lot of what has been driving the innovation and creativity is the combination of a very innovative, competitive commercial sector with a clearly defined need from warfighting. The tendency is to think that you should throw money against that problem to scale it up, but it's not clear that dollars or whatever currency you choose is actually the vehicle that's driving the innovation. It's the combination, I think, of the competition and clarity of need. So I want to take away from that, not that you don't need to invest in these things, not that there's not a value both on the VC side and broader private capital side or on the government contracting side to do that. We absolutely should keep doing that. But this isn't a problem that just doubling or tripling your dollars is going to solve on its own. The lessons. I think the lessons are basically you need a much faster iterative cycle that takes operational need to technology to testing, ideally and as close to field testing as you can get, and then back around again, right? And the faster you can do that cycle with real testing of real technology in the hands of real warfighters, the faster you get that innovation and creation cycle to drive technology improvements. The Department of Defense has many great and amazing things about it, but that innovation and testing cycle, the sort of ability to field kind of scaled finished capabilities, is a real pain point and one that I think needs attention and improvement.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on that? You spoke about some of the tangible platforms, the low-end drones, munitions, but you also said something about the information networks. How do you see innovation in that space, and any lessons from how information was used or shared or transmitted or relayed from that conflict that you could see carried forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you have to think. I think about the communication networks for autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicles as evolving both the communication from the person to any individual asset like a drone, and then from that drone to anything else that's around it. How can it do it? And both of those, that sort of longer run command and control, and then the broader sort of communication structure that allows it to continue to navigate and move, are two separate but related problems that need to be solved. But they are not the disruption that happens in that, the jamming and blocking, are things that happen intentionally in the military, but even that is not a uniquely military problem. And I think my core takeaway is there's actually a lot of creative thinking on how you ensure resilient communications that occurs in the commercial sector, and that often gets left on the cutting room floor because in the Department of Defense and in the intelligence community, we have a tendency to think of our problems as more bespoke than they actually are.
Thomas, I know you spend some time thinking about drones, but a lot of time thinking about other forms of conflict.
I think obviously the war in Ukraine has been occupying and absorbing a lot of attention by people who watch technology in this context for a very long time. So it's maybe worth just quickly going back to the opening days and weeks and even the time before, really, and extract two quick points. First, we have seen one of the operations that I think will, in hindsight, still be considered one of the most interesting ones, and that is the Russian attempt to blind some Ukrainian command and control infrastructure by taking down, by messing with modems that the Ukrainians were using for receiving via satellite, owned by Viasat, signals, I mean, SATCOM, effectively. And that caused a lot of collateral damage across the entire cone of the satellite downlink beam. And why is this an interesting case? One, because I think it was not as successful as a lot of people expected something like that to be, but also for another interesting reason that is neglected, because why do we know so much about it? Well, because really in particular, because one person who happens to be working with us as well discovered the actual sample, the malware, through a very clever Yara rule, thanks to Google for owning Yara, by the way, for owning VirusTotal, by the way, and making that possible. So we know so much because some very crafty investigator discovered the sample, the malware, the binary, and analyzed it together with a couple other people. So the bigger lesson I think that I want to extract here, apart from effects operations are not as successful as a lot of people expected them to be, and I think that is something that we see. Effects operations in the cyber operations context only. I'm excluding anything kinetic here from this conclusion, obviously. Are less effective than I think a lot of people expected them to be in that context, but there's a but, and a big but. And the but is that I think you will also recall the pre-bunking strategy that the Five Eyes employed in the run-up to the war. Some of you may recall this story of a major false flag operation that the Five Eyes effectively disclosed. And then it kind of never really happened in that form. Now, I take it there was actually decent intelligence for this thing to happen. So why did it not happen? Maybe because it was disclosed ahead of time. Only future historians will be able to answer that conclusively. But the point is, we see a lot of things that we don't see. A lot of intelligence and cyber operations related activity is simply collection and then acting on the intelligence very quickly on tactical levels, on operational levels, and even on strategic levels. And if I had to bet, as a sort of, again, putting on the hat of a future historian, I think that's where we'll see most interesting developments in this war. But we will only see them exposed once people start writing memoirs and once the archives open, or maybe a little earlier if something else happens. But for now, we can only assess what went on in Ukraine with a big grain of salt because we don't really see enough.
I think that's interesting because we've been looking at the war in the popular discourse as something that's catalyzed a huge global response, a response by the United States, but something that really reflects the use of new technologies in new ways. But Radha, as you said, people are still digging trenches. People are still back ordering munitions. Some of the same plays are being run, but in slightly different ways and with some learning that is specific to that conflict and to the very short demand cycles there. So maybe we can come back to this and refer to this case in my question to the other two of you, which is really about this question of the demand signals that the private sector is hearing from the defense establishment and that the Defense Department is perceiving itself when it comes to AI, right? You see a lot of this, you hear a lot of this. Are these efforts to solve new problems with short cycles of analysis? Are they efforts to make old problems solved more efficiently? And then I know, Jane, in particular, you spend a lot of time thinking about test and evaluation. Help us understand why that is challenging at the intersection of defense and AI, as you're trying to understand what the demand is from consumers and then respond to it with something practical and usable.
Sure. Thank you for that question. That's a great question. All of the above, right? So in terms of solving existing problems or solving new problems, one of the newer problems is the abundance of information that we see, right? The abundance of drone footage, the abundance of different intelligence sources that we need to fuse together, et cetera. And so we're absolutely seeing a very high demand from the warfighter and being able to process that information faster, being able to sift through it, get insights out of it faster and with better quality, so that the human can potentially focus on some other tasks. We're seeing a big demand for autonomy in general, and especially taking over from the human when it comes to boring tasks, when it comes to tasks that are easily automated, and when it comes to tasks that are dangerous, right? We would love to get our humans out of harm's way. Very similarly, we're also seeing a lot of demand for getting other humans out of harm's way, right? We're talking about potentially weapons, right, that are a lot more precise. They can potentially be used to actually create conflict that goes faster and causes a lot less casualties and things like that. We're seeing a lot of great use cases in predictive logistics as well, predictive maintenance, figuring out when something's going to break before it breaks, making sure you can have the right part in place, and many other dimensions of the supply chain in general and making that more resilient. And then finally, a lot of use cases in cognitive EW and electronic warfare, a lot of use cases in cyber as well, the ability to kind of get a big picture. This is what AI is great at, right? Sifting through lots of data, helping figure out when something is anomalous, when something doesn't belong, and increasing that resiliency. Now, having said all of this, why is testing hard in the military? Testing has always been hard in the military. Some of this is not a new problem. And testing is hard because traditionally testing is done before deployment, which means that you have a warfighter that needed a system yesterday. You have a program manager and many others who have invested the last 10 years building a system. And now I raise my hand and say, hey, it doesn't work, right? So of course, testing is hard for that reason. It's hard because the requirements emerge, especially with this technology that evolves so very quickly. It's hard because it takes a lot of time and money, and what you get is not necessarily something super tangible out of it. And it's hard because it takes a lot of time and resources. DoD is also not known for data quality, right? And in some cases, actually, we have great data when it comes to data on DoD's humans. There are great resources there when it comes to a lot of predictive maintenance data. But we also have a lot of silos in the Department of Defense, and for good reason, very often. But nevertheless, AI obviously operates better when more data are available, and when data are labeled well, and especially when it comes to AI, when those data represent the operational reality well. And that's probably one of our bigger challenges as we envision future environments where we might operate in. We don't necessarily have great representations of those data, including threat data. Of course, security and adversarial robustness is something we take very seriously, and AI-enabled systems are still fairly brittle. So there's that level of challenge. And then finally, when it comes to the Department of Defense, and especially some of the things that the Department of Defense does, auditability and assigning responsibility and accountability can be really critical, right? Especially when it comes to systems that may enable lethality. Obviously, with AI-enabled systems, we're still kind of digging through some of the explainability, some of the trustworthiness type research. And while it's very exciting to be a tester for the Department of Defense at this time and trying to figure out how all of this is going to work, again, ideally, testing is not holding up deployment of the systems that the warfighter needs. And so there's always that tension between a program that needs to get going and also our basic democratic values, which won't allow us to field anything when it might be a liability rather than an asset.
I wanted to share a brief story that I think is important for the audience to hear about the impact of Ukraine. To your first question, and that was almost 10 years ago when I was working in the Department of Defense. I was given the task of trying to do outreach and engagement with Silicon Valley. This was around the time that the first drafts of the first plans of establishing the Defense Innovation Unit experimental were being created, and I remember convening a sort of salon-style dinner at the Rosewood Hotel, a very famous hotel right on Sand Hill Road, in the heart of the epicenter of this community, and bringing some founders together with some military officers and some investors. And it was a fascinating conversation, and it went something like this. I'm going to paraphrase super short. A very impassioned plea from a very senior Navy officer inviting the investors to support building companies that would advance America's interests and save lives for Americans, and especially American service members, men and women. And the investors responded by saying, you're just such a bad customer that I can't count any revenue from your contracts as recurring revenue. So when a founder comes to me and asks for an investment in our company, I count all the money that you give them as $0. Like literally, it's fine if they want to work with you, but we discourage it because it will distract them, and I don't even guarantee that any money you give them will even ever come again the following year. And then even more vexing and confusing to me, coming from Washington, D.C., was a response from a brilliant young founder starting a quantum computing company. And he said, a lot of people think that I won't work with the Department of Defense because it's immoral. But that's not true. I just think it's boring. And he explained, he says, I've made a lot of money in my first two companies, and I don't need to make any more money anymore. But I'm passionate about tech. I love engineering, and I want to work on the hardest and most important problems. And more children will die of malnutrition next year, guaranteed, or lack of access to clean water, than any civilians will die in armed conflict next year. And if I want to worry about remote high-risk scenarios in the future, like the effective altruist buddies talk about here in the Bay Area, then climate change is the most important problem for me to solve. And again, maybe I could work on some problem that you have in the Defense Department that would possibly have an impact on a war that will probably never happen and we hope never does. But if I spend my energy and my talents on making energy abundant or reducing climate emissions, I'm definitely going to save the greatest number of people. So it's not that I think the Defense Department is immoral, I just think it's not the most use of my time. And I had prepared many responses to why just war theory should rationalize technologists supporting America and our allies, but I had no responses to these arguments. But I realized years later that the underlying premise of these arguments was a set of core beliefs that were widely held by this kind of techno-utopian version of what these incredible inventors and investors were working on, which was they assumed that war between great powers to grab land from each other and commit atrocities against innocent civilians was part of our history and not our future. And they just couldn't imagine a scenario in which we would be in a true great power competition, between countries like the United States and China, or the United States and Russia, or Russia and Ukraine. And this scenario was just not on the table for them, and so they were not working with us because of those priors. And the reason why Ukraine is so important to the future of technology in our country is it has put to bed that once and for all. Now, all technologists in the world understand that the threats are real, that the harms are real, that everyone needs to pick sides, that you cannot be on the sidelines, that you have to be engaged in the world, and that the work that we do in national security and diplomacy and development and all the things that we do is really much too important to ignore, that it deserves its place alongside these other issues. And so we have seen a dramatic change. Companies like mine, Google, but also others like Microsoft, could not go fast enough to make contributions to support what was going on in Ukraine. We've seen the entire investor community, even those that were not wanting to invest in defense technology before, now all of them are doing it. Now every important venture capitalist is investing in this, and I think you can't ignore the impact of this. And so I don't think anyone but Putin could have made the case so strongly for why it is a moral imperative to be part of this. And now we see incredible change of the attitudes of everyone. And so the bookend of this is last year, I was at an investor conference in New York City in One World Trade Center of all places. And one of the founders on the panel said, when I saw it was going to Ukraine, I took my small garage drone company and I moved to Ukraine. This founder moved there and is in the fight, right, learning. And I said, you know, you're risking your life. Why are you there? And he says, I have access to customers and problems and engineering talent and a feedback loop that anyone in the Bay Area can't match. There's lots of drone companies trying to compete to learn what's going on and to make contracts with what's going on in Ukraine. But he's like, I need to be there. And so he moved there. And then he got a standing ovation from everyone in that room, the students, the investors, the fellow founders, because he's risking his safety for his company because his company is mission-driven. And I think that's the impact of Ukraine on the tech sector.
And can I just add one thing that I think is worth foot stomping in Josh's point? It's not just that you can't sit on the sidelines. To that quantum sort of discussion, a huge amount of the game-changing technology in Ukraine is the emerging technology. It is a creative way to build the drones, a creative advanced manufacturing process that you can do in a decentralized way to work. Like different approaches to remote control and communications, alternative ways to attach and affix munitions to, right? So there's just a host of clear applications that resonate, are hard problems that resonate with that community. And I think that's an important combination of things. Like our strength is our strength. And our strength is we have an incredibly innovative emerging tech sector, and they can now see themselves in the strength of our military and in those military applications, and that's not nothing.
If Ukraine has been a touch point of the public conversation, another major touch point has been a conflict that hasn't happened yet, which is in the Pacific, right? And I just want to ask as a follow-up, as you think about the demand that you hear for AI and AI kind of solutions, that could be a very different theater, right? In Ukraine, you have a grinding tactical conflict. You have the ability to have these very sort of fast feedback loops with ground forces and terrestrial networks. You have a lot of, interface with conventional munitions and other things. The Pacific, hugely distributed maritime environment, contested in a different way. How do you think about some of, the challenges that AI-enabled kinds of technologies might be able to have in that environment? Jane, you talked about the challenge of finding good data, right? And also cognitive EW, which was not on my bingo card. Maybe you can explain what that is. But just before we move on, how do you think about the ways in which future conflicts that involve disruptive technologies may in fact be in a very different context or environment than what we saw in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, look, the difference with China is scale, bluntly. And I mean that in every dimension. It's not just military, it's economic. And so those pieces really matter. It's not just terrestrial, it's now all domains, right? You need to be able to do it in land and sea and air and space and integrate those in a seamless way. And it's not just munitions, now it's also platforms. You can't just have bombs, you need planes and ships and submarines, right? So all of the things we just talked about are still true, but they're true for more things in more dimensions over a longer period of time, which makes the challenge more complex. I think so that sounds negative. Let me put that in a slightly positive way, which is it also means it's an all hands on deck moment, right? Like in the same way that if you're a drone manufacturer, you have a role to play in Ukraine, you have a role to play in China, but same thing if you're a shipbuilder or if you're building cloud environments, or if you're figuring out data networks, or if you do financial management, right? Like all of these pieces need to work together in a coherent ecosystem to actually deliver both the pointy end of the spear and the lever arm of the spear to deliver effect in a kind of competitive advantage sense. And so I think that's the China problem. The thing I'll just note on the AI specific pieces, I think we do have a moment here, and I worry sometimes that it's passing us by. And the closest analogy I can give is the 5G moment, right? There is a moment where you need the networks plus the hardware and compute plus the data plus the applications to create an integrated AI ecosystem that allows us to really take advantage of everything from advanced ML ops to the new generative and agentic AI. If that is ceded to Chinese companies and or Chinese government solutions, that will mean we'll use 5G Huawei networks on Huawei devices using DeepSeek applications with our data plus the Chinese data. And that's not an ecosystem that lends itself to, US or even, US and allies and partners advantage. And so it's important to keep in mind not just the advantages we have, but the timing, and time really matters here.
And if I can build on that just a tiny bit, because some of the threads I'd like to pull out of what you just said. Number one, the fact that it's an all domain and an all hands on deck problem. One of the many things that we learned from Ukraine is the importance of a highly motivated population, right? That's what enabled them to have this kind of David and Goliath moment. And as Josh, as you pointed out, we're just getting there probably, right? We have not been there probably for a long time. And then additionally, because it is such an all domain across, land, sea, air, space, cyber, et cetera, kind of problem, and because it does involve so much equipment, now we're talking about integrating new shiny models onto legacy platforms that were never meant to interact with each other, let alone with AI sometimes, right? So that is a pretty substantial problem that we're not necessarily seeing to such a great extent, right? Of talking about wrong lessons to be learned. We're not necessarily seeing it to such a great extent in Ukraine, again, because it's a very different environment, much smaller scale. But on a larger scale, that's one of the biggest issues that we have that we're trying to work our way through right now, is that issue of integration between different types of technologies.
Yeah, I would also be reluctant to discuss AI in the context of Ukraine or Taiwan, because it's one, very complicated and doesn't straight up apply in the way that a lot of people think it does. But I wanted to offer a contrarian, somewhat different angle on a potential South China Sea scenario. And that is, if you're President Xi and his advisors looking at Ukraine, the factor of time is probably quite important to you, because you will easily understand that the United States doesn't have stamina. They just can't stick it out for more than a small number of years. And that's the lesson we learned also in Afghanistan, by the way, or Iraq, if you want to go that far. But certainly in Ukraine right now, it seems to be playing out that way. So we're looking at old societies here, both Russia and Ukraine, even older societies and their own self-perception in China. And in my view, that is a really crucial factor. If you think you have both the amount of people you can throw into the fight, the patience to really keep them in the fight, the ability to tolerate pain, as opposed, what I mean by that is people dying at larger scale, which for no doubt they have more pain tolerance than the United States has here. And then on top of all that, the ability to make things along the lines of what you just suggested. I mean, let's look at Ukraine and put a sort of bumper sticker on it. It's a bit of a cyberpunk war scenario. Lots of old machines and a lot of new high tech, and you combine them in sort of really cool new ways. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a similar type scenario in a longer war in another context down the line in the future. And then it all comes down to who has, higher pain tolerance, who can make more things for both types of scenarios. Make more new things, faster cycle in terms of drone production, innovation there, but also just make more munition and things that you can fire with all the old machines and keep that going. And there's no doubt in my mind that China is in a pretty strong position on all those counts. So, I mean, that's just a bit of a contrarian take, one that makes me rather pessimistic also.
So to be contrarian to your contrarian, and admittedly, like I'm a statistician, so this is all out of domain for me, but denial and deception, right? Other asymmetric types techniques. That's one of the great things we're learning in the Russia-Ukraine war is that denial and deception are alive and well. It's obviously a very important part of the Chinese doctrine as well. But as you look at all of these asymmetric relationships and asymmetric threats, does that change some of what you just said? I'm not sure it does.
You mean whether deception would change any of that?
It could become a less symmetric fight. That's all.
I mean, the way I would look at this whole discourse on influence operations, deception, and active measures, and if you take Russia as the historically as the country, the Soviet Union, as the entity with the most organizational, bureaucratic resources that they threw at deception over time and active measures. They did this in a highly conspiratorial domestic setup. Effectively, they sometimes believed their own lies for complicated reasons that we can go into. I think we are again at a moment in time where believing your own lies is a trend in many different countries. That creates sort of a conspiratorial worldview that in itself is linked to technology in ways that we're not fully understanding, that is highly disruptive and to democracy itself, and very dangerous to watch.
And let me just, the other point I think on producing things is just worth a moment on. So if I take off my AI hat and put on my economist hat, there are some interesting things I think we can see from what happened in production in the US, in the West, and in Russia, kind of in response to Ukraine. So as mentioned, we just had to produce more stuff, and in particular, we needed to produce munitions. The US was underproducing them for a variety of reasons, as was Russia. Now, we certainly saw Russia ramp up its production faster. A couple reasons for that. One, their capital-intensive production was higher to begin with, so they were already manufacturing stuff. They could move to manufacture more stuff faster. So their kind of their level increase happened faster, but their slope of their production function looks different than the slope of our production function. And it's worth taking that out of economist speak and putting that into real talk, which is we actually innovate on production. We think about alternative manufacturing. We think about alternative materials. We think about alternative munitions. We think about how we can leverage the intellectual property rights we have and use that to incentivize companies to speed up production on cost per units, which relies on a property rights and return on investment economic system that we have, that the Russians have, and also the Chinese don't have. So I think, we're not gonna outcompete the Chinese on their economic model. And so you're absolutely right. If we're in a world where we need to socialize the means of production and then produce the military assets we need, we're hosed. But that's not actually our ecosystem, right? Our ecosystem is we have a bunch of capabilities we need. The commercial sector all the time comes up with them, whether it's counter IED work, whether it's drone work, right? Whatever that solution is, we've got an ecosystem that has the very best innovators who can solve it, sometimes just in time, sometimes with a little bit of extra time, but can definitely solve it. And the problem we face is actually just how do we field that faster? That's a way better problem than figuring out how do you solve it and make it, right? We can make it. And I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, I am super confident that the US economic system has the incentives to make it. And so now the question is, how do we make sure that the procurement and economic system, the budget system and political system, doesn't get in the way of that innovation? And I think that's kind of the order of the day. And that's a much more tractable, if complicated problem for all the reasons stated here, but very different than the economic problem.
I'm still sort of thinking about being contrarian to Thomas's contrarianism about the speed of a conflict. I mean, you think about it's possible there could be a very long, protracted conflict in East Asia, but it's also, most of the Taiwan scenarios you read, it talks about a very decisive first week in which the United States is trying to, with partners, prevent the complete takeover of Taiwan while reinforcements can stream from Hawaii and the United States. And so if there is a very fast conflict, then you don't have all this time to iterate and use the best of American innovation. You're really left with dealing with what you have in that moment.
I don't know, who says? Like, we can make stuff fast and good and a lot. No, I'm serious. Like, you're thinking of that in a munitions and fighting, but like, we just talked about all domains, all hands, all things, cyber, EW, AI capabilities, detection, asset movement, predictive maintenance, right? Like, all of those things are software solutions that generate advantage and can generate them really fast. So the question is not the question isn't, can you generate a thing fast? The question is, what is it that you need to generate to make sure you have advantage in the first 24 hours and the first 7 days and the first 3 months and the first 6 months, and do that over and over again in a system that people can understand how to plug into. And I think we get ourselves riled up about the wrong thing. It's not that we can't make the stuff. It's not that we can't solve the problem. It's that we solve the problem when we don't know how to get it to the people who need it. And we should solve that problem.
Josh, did you have some?
I just didn't realize we were going to be adjudicating a hypothetical war game about the South China Sea. But here we are. I yield my time to the moderator for the next topic.
Sure. I wanted to ask about institutions, because many of you have spent time trying to make institutions, defense adjacent institutions, function better for this kind of innovation. And whether it is long cycle innovations or short cycle innovations, whether, and I wanted to get your take on, how far have we actually come here? What have you learned? What has worked? Where do you think, orient us to where we are in that story of the institutions being able to move more quickly?
You led those institutions, Radha. I feel like you should.
Well, okay, I'm going to kick this over to Josh, because really I think I came in on kind of like chapter 3 or 4, really from some of the work Josh helped stand up and create really inside the department. I'll tell you where I think we are. I think we have successfully and convincingly defined the problem. I think we're all in agreement on the problem. And the basic problem is we're pretty good at R&D, could do better in the government, pretty good in the commercial sector. We're not so bad about buying hardware. It's a little slow. It ends up being over cost and on schedule. We're really off the mark on how we buy new technology. It's not fast enough. It takes a long time to deploy. We don't have good models for scaling it. And so we've got to figure out all of those pieces. I think the problem we have really licked is, to kind of go back to the earlier point, the willingness of both the capital side and the founder innovator side to come to the table and actually tell us what's not working and what they need, right? And I think that's really important. I just don't think we've, and I think that took a lot of work, and maybe I'll just pause there because I think that's a helpful kind of lead into, that was, I think, the big blocker, and that has unstuck a lot.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, so I would say, listen, I work at a tech company, but I'm not a technologist, and I never have been. I think of myself as a student of institutions, and that's why I loved your question. And so I think, what we have been trying to figure out how to do is to build institutions, adapt institutions, or disrupt institutions to take advantage of this moment that we're in and to evolve. And really, I think this is a great moment to be asking ourselves these questions, because this really began with Chuck Hagel in 2014 when he launched the Defense Innovation Initiative, and it was a remarkably bipartisan set of initiatives that different secretaries of defense have built on successively, and I got to serve under multiple of them, and we are now in another cycle, I'll say, of creative destruction. I'll euphemistically refer to it. A lot of change in institutions now, and the advice I would give is essentially you really have to understand is one fact that all business school professors have now come to understand about organizations and when and under what circumstances they adapt, and a set of distinctions as a result. And so the fact is we now have half a century of business school literature that shows that large incumbent organizations don't disrupt themselves. The circumstances under which they evolve or create new value or are creative at problem solving always involves creating a very small team with a counterculture that's apart enough from the rest of the organization to be different, right? And this, Clayton Christensen understood this innovator's dilemma, and we've seen this over and over again, whether it's Procter & Gamble or it's Disney or it's Google or any of these things, they have some kind of innovation organization separate. And the organizations, the big organizations that manage to ingest the benefits of those small countercultural organizations and turn them into useful products survive, and all the others are disrupted and go away, and they become Kodak or Blockbuster. They fail. And the last decade of DoD's history is the history of attempting to do that. So when you look at the proliferation of what we call innovation organizations or innovation formations, it is the most important component structures of the department imitating each other, trying to create separate and apart cultures that can drive innovation and change. And so, you begin with a defense innovation unit, but very quickly you have AFWERX in the Air Force, and then the Navy creates Naval X, and then the Army creates Army Futures Command, and then the Air Force creates Air Force Futures Command. It's a dialectic of these organizations trying to participate with each other in a movement of disrupting themselves. And this is the second point I wanted to make is, if you want to categorize all of those organizations, I would refer to them as execution organizations and exploration organizations. Execution organizations are high reliability organizations that try to drive efficiency and do more and more at scale, and they achieve that scale by achieving consistency. And so you look at all the things that are like lean manufacturing and the total quality movement, and all these things are about being better and better and better by being bigger and bigger and driving sameness. And that's how we get really good at being the American way of war, right? We are the most scaled, high quality system of operating in that way. And that is how we deliver a high degree of consistency through our bureaucracy, which is the design of the bureaucracy. All of these new organizations, right, that have works in the end or innovation in the title, these are all exploration organizations in search of business models. The consistency culture destroys their value. It kills them, right? So in order to have both of those things, you have to be ambidextrous. You have to have really, really effective execution organizations. You have to have really, really effective exploration organizations. And what Radha told you brilliantly is the connective tissue between them that she and the leaders that she worked for were trying to figure out what's the right connection between the two. And the fear that I have is that when we go through a change of administration or a big budget drill or these boom-bust cycles, what happens is the big organization kills off the exploration organizations on purpose. And so when you hear Congress saying, well, how many software factories does DoD really need? Or they say, well, I think we just have too many of these new organizations, and I only want to consolidate around some big programs of record that is easy for appropriators to understand. What they're telling you is we want more execution and less exploration. That will be a fatal strategic error in this era of adaptation.
Are there any happy stories about where this has connected from the sort of exploration innovation side to the execution side through the program of record? I mean, in what context does this work best? Because I realize there's always a tension between the creative people who are trying to cut against the grain and the system that has its own structure.
I mean, at risk of overstepping my bounds here, I would invite you to talk about Replicator, because I think that is a great example of that.
No, I think that's right. So I think, taking a step back, the thing that I think drives a meaningful connection between the exploration and the execution, which I love the framing, is a clear mission imperative. I think for the Department of Defense, you've got an organization like parochial, self-interest aside for any organization. If you can align it to mission, you can get mostly everyone to line up along execution. And that is a truly astounding thing about working there. It's one of the greatest places I've ever worked on that. So with that said, Replicator, clear mission, right? We need a lot of attritable drones for a very specific mission set with a very specific concept of operations. How do we get there? Well, first, you've got a list of problems, and some of the problems are explorations. What are the platforms? What's the digital backbone? What's the test and evaluation structure? How do you field them? Where do you store them, right? Like there's a set of questions. And then there's the execution questions. How do you buy them? Like who's going to have the contracts? How do you produce them? What's the timeline for production? Once you produce them, how do you make sure they can all talk to you, right? Like there's a whole bunch of execution questions. You got to answer both. And you've got to get out a program that really, I joke sometimes I'm a little ideas person. I don't have a brilliant plan for you, but you tell me a thing you want to execute, I'll make you a poem with the milestones, and we can have a set of meetings on a routine basis to check in. And that's kind of the secret sauce, I think, of knitting these two together, where you could actually get real progress on figuring out the things you want to buy through exploration, and then how to buy them through execution. Figuring out what actually does it mean to have own and homogeneous system autonomy versus heterogeneous systems autonomy, and then how do you actually buy that and test that and make sure the stuff integrates, right? And like keep doing that piece by piece, and you'll get this transition, and you'll get, you know, a lot of things you need for a specific mission. And the point of Replicator is really, if you do that with attention and focus, you can get things done that you feel like should take years in months. And now I think the exercise for the reader is, how do you do that in a lot more things and not just this one particular program?
Thomas, you had something?
Yeah, I feel like, I take I read the hand signs from Olga, and it seems we're coming to a close of the pre-Q&A session here soon. So I wanted to slot in sort of a bigger observation that's not in direct reaction to what you just said, but I think fits the topic very well, disruptive technology and conflict. And that is, I'm struck by the moment we're in. I was and is it okay to say something that is just under Chatham House rules and force you to cut it out of the YouTube video? Is that okay? Okay, cool. Now add to this the international dimension that I just hinted at, where a lot of technology companies, not only in AI, but across the board, are perceived as being part of this America that we can no longer really trust. But can I then trust the technology services that, for example, Google is providing, or Meta is providing, or Amazon is providing? That is a very, very real, I'm not endorsing any of this, by the way, I'm just reporting this to you. That's a very real question for a lot of people out there. Outside of this country, so I'm quite concerned about the near-term future for tech in this space because of its inherently polarizing potential, and hence my sort of New Yorker quote here, and then the way this potential can get escalated, exacerbated on the international stage because of where we are right now.
That was the optimistic note you were looking for.
I always rely on Thomas for the happy talk. No, I was going to ask you and Jane both a question about what are you watching for in the future? What are the things? And and you answered that question. There's a social dimension, and then there's a partner dimension, right? And thinking about with whom does the United States want to partner? Who's comfortable partnering with the United States at different levels? And being part of the same technology ecosystem or information sharing. These things are more contested than they were. They're less predictable than they were, and we're all having to navigate that. I want to ask you that question. In everyone's job, as they look at an industry or in a domain, there are always things that they're watching for, right? On the horizon, that will be indicators that a certain technology is working, a certain policy is working, right? What are some of the things in your work thinking about AI and defense and the validation of these systems that you're watching for that will give you a sense of the shape of the role of these technologies in conflict?
So I'll talk about that a little bit, but I also want to kind of emphasize that one of the great things that's coming back is just good old systems engineering. right? Because it's amazing. We tend to think, yes, these systems are inherently less predictable and less explainable maybe than some of the other systems we're used to. But fundamentally, the idea of identifying clear requirements, as you said, right? Being able to actually figure out what is the problem you're trying to solve? What do you actually need to solve it? I know this administration in particular is more concerned with effectiveness, more concerned with lethality for specifically systems that are meant for that, right? That is still going back to the basics. Does it work? Is it effective? Does it work as intended? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Does it not do what it's not supposed to do? It's not as, I don't think it changed as much as people make it out to be when it comes to at least kind of the test and evaluation world. Fundamentally, we're still interested in technology that works, that does what we need it to do. So that's that. Now, having said that, some of the things that we're observing, some of the trends, obviously, miniaturizing things, right? Because we want to be able to function in contested environments, so making things simultaneously more resilient, but also making things function at the tactical edge, which often requires for them to be smaller. So we're seeing quite a bit of that, and especially interesting, I think, are going to be some of the biology. That's one of the things that I'm very excitedly watching, is both synthetic biology, but also biosecurity type issues. Anything from, and we've seen some of this in Russia, obviously, already, both the positive and the negative kind of uses of it. Very interesting things in hypersonics, right? We're very focused on kind of detecting of things, so we're able to potentially compromise them, but things are getting developed that are a lot harder to find, that go a lot faster than we're used to. So those are, it's probably not that revolutionary of a statement, but those are some of the things that I'm watching out for.
I'll close by asking both of you. I know you're living at the edge. You could talk about that. But things that you're watching for that could be markers of the ways in which these technologies are likely to be enabling conflict or helping to deter conflict.
Yeah, I mean, we've already hit on it a little bit in talking about some of the risks of what I'll call disinformation or misinformation or propaganda, or you can kind of pick your terminology. But I think propaganda is not a new concept, and we know it to be effective when we use it positively for commercial purposes. We call it marketing, right? So like we know there is an ability for persuasion based on visual context, and we know that if you do that at scale and test enough things, you will get better and better at it. And I worry about how that is used and what it is used for and by who. And I mean that for all of the governments everywhere. And so I think that we saw this a little bit kind of rise and change, I guess, with social media. I think this is a sort of new version of that, and I do worry a lot about that. The other thing I worry about is less on the technology and more on the policy side, which is a real bifurcated approach to how we manage the technology, where it's either entirely unregulated and unfettered and unchecked in how it uses data, what it uses data for, and what applications it can use, or it is extremely heavily regulated such that the use of the technology goes underground or doesn't get adopted in kind of, and in a very pragmatic way, think if there are these new technologies and they seem useful, people are going to figure out a way around to use them. And so just thinking about what the right policy, I will call it policy management space is, which can't be either extreme, but I don't think we have a modern policy management system that really takes into account these type of digital technology with true social impact. And so I'm, very interested in things like the EU AI law and how DeepSeek performed relative to the set of censored underlying data it's allowed to use and not allowed to use, right? Like these are all indicators that give us a sense of how policy interacts with the technology performance.
I think there are so many profound risks and concerns with AI, and you give such an eloquent and troubling description of some of them. But it's also really important that we remember the benefits. And if we only focus on the risks, it will lead us to make poor decisions. So for a little bit of audience participation, let me just ask you, if you used Google Maps to get somewhere today, would you raise your hand? In the last week? Search, right? These are AI products. We don't call them AI products, but they're fully integrated with AI. Or if you use ChatGPT or Gemini, we know we're using AI, but there's all these things throughout your day when you're benefiting from these technologies and where these technologies are headed that we don't think about. Getting to your location faster is a convenience, but I think about things that are much more than convenient. I have cancer survivors in my family. I imagine many people in this room either have survived cancer or know someone that has, or tragically has lost someone to cancer. We are going to cure many cancers with machine learning. If you had COVID and survived it, if you have a COVID vaccination, none of those would have been invented without machine learning to accelerate that process. We are going to invent more new drugs and therapies using AI in the next decade than the past century. And so we are going to save lives with these technologies. And so, that's something that I'm looking forward to. We have to protect our democracy. We have to deter our enemies. We have to think about, what is truth in this world, and we have to protect ourselves. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that we are going to unleash a tidal wave of human flourishing and reduce tragic suffering with this technology. And we need to balance those costs and benefits appropriately.
It's always great to be able to end a panel with a tidal wave of human flourishing. I hope that inspires you, and I'm grateful to the panelists here for a really wide-ranging conversation about technologies, about their intersection with social problems and some hard defense problems that are coming up in the future. I know we have more panels to get to, so join me in thanking this distinguished group.